What would you do if your HOA decided your land was no longer yours? If one day, without warning, they claimed it as part of their community expansion and expected you to just step aside? Jack Mercer didn't have to wonder. He was living it. For over a decade, his 2-acre property had been his sanctuary, a quiet, self-sustaining retreat on the outskirts of Oak Ridge, long before the neighborhood swallowed up the surrounding land. When he first bought it, the area was nothing but open fields and scattered farmhouses, untouched by the suffocating grip of a homeowners association. He had built his home with his own 2 hands, laid every brick, planted every tree, and made it clear to anyone who asked, he had no interest in joining the HOA. Then came Karen Fields. Karen had been running the Oak Ridge HOA with an iron fist for the past 3 years, turning it from a simple neighborhood association into a mini-dictatorship. Under her rule, nothing escaped regulation. Grass could only be 2 inches high, fences had to be HOA-approved colors, and even the placement of garden gnomes required board approval. If there was a rule to be enforced, Karen made sure it was done with zero tolerance. But what she wanted most? Jack's land. To Karen, his property was an unacceptable blight, an unregulated rogue lot that didn't conform to the pristine, cookie-cutter vision of Oak Ridge. She convinced the HOA board that it was being wasted on a single homeowner when it could be transformed into something better, a new park, a playground, maybe even a picnic area. Karen had made up her mind. Jack Mercer was going to sell, whether he liked it or not. And so, one warm evening, as Jack sat on his porch with a cold beer in hand, he saw her approaching, a stiff smile, a manila folder tucked under her arm, and the air of someone who had already decided the outcome of the conversation. Jack sighed. He already knew where this was going. Jack barely had time to finish his beer before the real fight began. 3 days after Karen's visit, he stepped out onto his porch and immediately noticed something off. A bright orange paper slapped onto his mailbox, fluttering slightly in the early morning breeze. His gut told him it wasn't anything good. Ripping it off, he scanned the bold print at the top. Violation notice, failure to maintain lawn aesthetics. Fine, $250. Jack let out a short, humorless laugh. Aesthetic violations? On property that wasn't even part of the HOA? They had to be joking. Except they weren't. The next morning, as he walked down his gravel driveway, coffee in hand, he spotted a small group of people standing at the edge of his land. They were dressed just like Karen, polos, slacks, clipboards in hand, whispering among themselves. Jack recognized a few of them as Oak Ridge residents, but none he had ever spoken to. They were surveying his property, taking notes like inspectors at a crime scene. Jack took a slow sip of coffee before strolling toward them. "Morning," he greeted, his tone calm but firm. "Something I can help you with?" The murmuring stopped. A balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, an HOA badge pinned neatly to his chest, cleared his throat. "Just conducting a routine assessment," he said, flipping a page on his clipboard like he had actual authority here. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Assessment of what, exactly?" The man adjusted his glasses, hesitant, but then regained his confidence. "Your lawn, for one. It's not in compliance with community standards." Jack let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head. "Let me stop you right there. I don't have to comply with your HOA's standards. My land isn't part of Oak Ridge, never has been. I don't pay your fees, I don't follow your rules, and I sure as hell don't answer to some clipboard-wielding committee." A tense silence hung between them. One of the women leaned in, whispering something to the bald man, who gave a small nod before adjusting his glasses again. "Well," he said, clearing his throat. "Your property borders HOA land, and as such, its upkeep directly impacts the visual harmony of the community. The HOA has the right to enforce basic." Jack took a slow, deliberate step forward, towering over him. "That so?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The man faltered. "Why, yes. And if these violations aren't addressed, fines will be issued. If necessary, the HOA can escalate unresolved issues to the county." Jack exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. They weren't just harassing him anymore. This was an organized power play. Karen wasn't taking no for an answer, she was trying to force him into compliance. "All right," Jack said finally, stepping back. "You do what you gotta do." He gestured toward his house with his coffee cup. "And I'll do what I gotta do." With that, he turned his back on them, strolling away without another word. But he could feel their eyes burning into his back, waiting to see if their scare tactics had worked. They hadn't. Over the next week, things escalated fast. First, it was the mailbox. One morning, Jack stepped outside and found it knocked clean off its post, the wood splintered as if someone had taken a bat to it. No cameras, no proof, just a mysteriously destroyed mailbox. A nice touch. Then came the letters, every other day, a new one stuffed into his doorframe. Some were about his unkempt lawn. Others claimed he had an unauthorized structure, his shed, which had been there for years. The most absurd? A warning for excessive outdoor storage, which he could only assume referred to his neatly stacked pile of firewood. But the real kicker? One afternoon, Jack found a thick envelope in his mailbox, despite the post still being half broken. Inside was an invoice from the Oak Ridge HOA, listing several months' worth of unpaid HOA dues, over $1,000 in total. At the bottom, printed in bold red letters. "Failure to pay within 30 days will result in a lien being placed on your property." Jack stared at the letter in disbelief. This wasn't just Karen being petty anymore. This was fraud. Jaw tightening, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the invoice. After being shuffled through an automated menu, he finally landed on a human representative. "This is Debbie with Oak Ridge Homeowners Association, how can I assist you today?" Jack clenched his jaw. "Yeah, I just got an invoice claiming I owe HOA dues." "I don't. My property isn't under HOA control, so I'd love to know what kind of scam you're running." A brief pause, then a patronizing chuckle. "Sir, if you received a bill, that means you're responsible for those dues." Jack's patience was razor thin. "Let me say it again. I am not part of your HOA. Never signed anything. Never agreed to anything. Never paid anything." A sigh. "Sir, we can't discuss individual cases over the phone. But if you believe there's been an error, you're welcome to dispute it in writing. Otherwise, the balance remains due." And then, click. Jack stared at his phone. They had hung up on him. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an attempt to steal his land. Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But he wasn't going to play by her rules. She wanted to wear him down, push him out, make him feel like he had no choice but to sell. But Karen had seriously underestimated just how stubborn he could be. Jack barely had time to process the fake bills before the next phase of Karen's attack began. It started early, too early for anyone with common sense to be running power tools. A loud, grating thunk-thunk-thunk echoed through the crisp morning air, followed by the steady hum of construction equipment. Jack groggily stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, and froze. At the far end of his property, a crew of workers in neon vests was hammering a wooden post into the ground. A large white and green sign sat beside them, half wrapped in plastic. Jack didn't even need to see the words to know exactly what it said. Sure enough, as one worker peeled away the covering, the bold lettering came into view. Future site of Oak Ridge Community Park. Jack's grip tightened around his coffee mug. This was his land. His private property. He stormed toward the workers, his pulse drumming in his ears. "Hey," he barked. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" A graying man with a clipboard turned, barely giving Jack a glance before flipping a page. "Just putting in the notice, sir. Prep starts next week." Jack scoffed. "Prep for what? You're on my land." Now the man looked up, confused. "This is HOA property." Jack let out a sharp laugh, because what else could he do? "No. It's not." The man frowned, checking his clipboard. "Says right here, this land is under the jurisdiction of Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Approved for annexation last quarter." Jack clenched his jaw. "Then your paperwork is either forged or just plain wrong. This land belongs to me, and if you so much as put another nail into the ground, you're trespassing." A long silence stretched between them. The workers, once busy, now exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the foreman sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, we're just following orders. If you got a problem, take it up with the HOA." Jack ripped the wooden sign out of the ground himself, tossed it into the back of his truck, and stormed inside. He already knew who was behind this. This time, he wasn't just going to sit back and let Karen play her games. By the time Jack pulled into the HOA office parking lot, he was seeing red. The building was too pristine, a brick fortress of manufactured power, with its sterile white walls and fake potted plants inside. The receptionist barely looked up, already bracing for whatever storm was coming her way. Jack didn't wait to be acknowledged. He strode straight to the counter and slammed the wooden park sign onto the desk with a loud thud. "I need to speak with Karen," he said, his voice dangerously calm. The receptionist blinked at the sign, then at him. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. But tell her Jack Mercer is here, and if she doesn't see me now, I'll be making a call to my lawyer instead." That did the trick. Less than a minute later, Karen appeared in the doorway, her usual smug expression firmly in place. "Jack," she said, feigning surprise. "I wasn't expecting you. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Jack clenched his fists. "Cut the act, Karen. I just caught your crew trying to stake claim to my land. Care to explain?" Her lips curled into a tight, knowing smile. "Oh, that? Just a misunderstanding." She gestured vaguely. "Our records show that your property was recently incorporated into Oak Ridge HOA's jurisdiction. A simple clerical update on your end, I'm sure." Jack laughed bitterly. "You and I both know that's a load of crap." Karen sighed, shaking her head. "That's debatable. The HOA board voted to expand our jurisdiction to include bordering lots. It's all perfectly legal." Jack leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "The board doesn't have that power." Karen tilted her head, her expression smug. "Actually, we do. Under the new Oak Ridge Community Planning Initiative, we were able to pass a motion that allows us to annex underdeveloped properties adjacent to HOA land, provided it benefits the community." Jack felt his blood pressure spike. "So let me get this straight. You just decided my land belonged to you?" She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "In a manner of speaking, yes." Jack exhaled sharply. This wasn't just petty fines and harassment anymore, this was outright theft. "You do realize that what you're doing is illegal, right?" His voice was measured, but the fury simmered beneath. Karen chuckled softly, folding her arms. "Oh, Jack. You're thinking too small. This isn't about taking your land, it's about making the right choice for the community. You can fight us all you want, but the reality is, this is happening. The county supports us. The board supports us. And soon, even the courts will see things our way. It's only a matter of time." Jack's jaw clenched. "You're insane if you think I'm going to let you steal my property." Karen's smile faded, irritation flashing across her face before she masked it. I think you're making a mistake. Jack met her gaze without flinching. And I think you've underestimated just how stubborn I can be. For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered. But before she could respond, the front doors of the HOA office swung open. Jack turned, and stiffened. A black SUV had pulled into the parking lot, its tinted windows making it impossible to see inside. 2 seconds later, a second car followed, this one a police cruiser. Jack's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. The officers stepped out, adjusting their belts. One of them spoke into his radio before both started toward him. Jack turned his head slightly, eyes locked on Karen. What did you do? He asked slowly. Karen's smirk returned, colder than ever. Oh, didn't I mention, she said smoothly, feigning innocence. You're trespassing on HOA property. And since you refused to vacate after official notice, I had to escalate the matter. Jack felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Karen had called the cops on him. Jack barely had time to process the fact that Karen had just weaponized the police against him before the officers reached him. The older cop, a stocky guy with a gruff expression, stopped a few feet away, glancing between Jack and Karen. Afternoon, sir. We got a call about an unauthorized occupant refusing to leave HOA property. Jack let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm despite the sheer absurdity of what was happening. You mean my property, he corrected, arms crossed. The younger officer, standing beside his partner, furrowed his brow. According to the report, this land was annexed under the Oak Ridge HOA and you were notified to vacate. Jack let out a bitter laugh. He should have seen this coming. Officer, he said, voice measured, I've owned this land for over a decade. The HOA has no legal claim to it, no matter what paperwork they've tried to fabricate. Karen took a step forward, arms crossed, exuding the self-satisfied arrogance of someone who believed she had already won. The transfer was approved through official HOA channels, she said smoothly. If there's any confusion, it's simply a matter of county records needing to update. Jack turned his gaze to the officers. You don't have to take my word for it. Call the county land records office. My name is still on the deed. A tense silence stretched between them. Finally, the older cop sighed, turning to his partner. Call it in. Karen's smirk slipped for the first time. That's unnecessary, she started, but the officer ignored her. The younger cop stepped away, radioing dispatch. Karen's posture stiffened, but Jack could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. 5 agonizing minutes passed before the officer returned. County records confirm, he said, glancing up. Deed is still in Mr. Mercer's name. Jack didn't even try to hide his smirk. Karen's mouth opened, then snapped shut. The older officer turned toward her. Ma'am, unless you have a court order stating otherwise, this is still private property. Karen let out a forced chuckle, shaking her head. This is ridiculous. The paperwork just hasn't been processed yet. The cop cut her off. That's not how it works. His voice hardened. And I'd suggest that the HOA cease any further attempts to harass this property owner. Otherwise, Mr. Mercer will have full legal grounds to file charges. Jack could see the color drain from Karen's face. The officers didn't wait for another argument. They gave Jack a firm nod, returned to their cruiser, and drove off, leaving Karen standing there, silent for the first time in her life. Jack leaned in slightly, dropping his voice just for her. You lost. Karen's jaw clenched. But she didn't say another word. She simply turned on her heel and stormed off. Jack should have known that meant she was about to get desperate. The next morning, Jack found a fresh stack of HOA violation notices taped to his front door. Small blue diamond unauthorized structure on property. Small Blue Diamond failure to comply with landscaping standards. Small Blue Diamond public nuisance complaint, no explanation. The sheer pettiness of it all made Jack laugh out loud. She was grasping at straws. But then, things got worse. By noon, he heard the crunch of tires in his driveway and looked up to see a black sedan pulling up. Two men in suits stepped out, and the moment Jack laid eyes on them, he knew this wasn't a social call. One of them approached, flashing a badge. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Detective Lawson with County Environmental Enforcement. We received an anonymous report of illegal hazardous waste dumping on your property." Jack blinked. "Come again?" The second officer pulled out printed photographs. Jack's stomach dropped. The images showed several rusted barrels, partially buried in the dirt, with warning labels for hazardous chemicals. Jack had never seen them before in his life. His jaw clenched. He knew exactly what this was. Karen had planted them. "Sir," the detective continued, flipping through his notes, "the complaint alleges that you've been storing and disposing of hazardous materials without proper permits. Given the nature of the substances, if this is confirmed, you could be facing serious legal penalties." Jack let out a slow breath. He had to think. "Stay calm. I'd like to show you something," he said evenly, pulling out his phone. He scrolled through his hidden security camera footage, the same cameras he had installed after his mailbox was destroyed. And there it was. Footage from 2:47 a.m. the previous night. A black SUV rolled up to his property. Several figures in dark clothing stepped out, hauling rusted barrels from the back and dumping them behind his fence. The camera was grainy, but there was one detail that made Jack's blood boil. A woman's silhouette stood at a distance, overseeing everything. Arms crossed. Stiff posture. Karen. Jack turned the phone toward the detectives, pressing play. "I don't know about you," he said, voice deceptively calm, "but it sure looks like someone just tried to frame me for a crime." Both men stared at the screen. The silence was deafening. Then, the first officer exhaled. "Mr. Mercer, would you be willing to provide us with a copy of this footage?" Jack smirked. "Oh, you can have as many copies as you like." Less than an hour later, police arrived at the HOA office. Karen had barely stepped outside when she froze at the sight of the two detectives. Jack watched from his porch as they escorted her toward their car. She wasn't under arrest, not yet, but the mere fact that law enforcement was questioning her in full view of the entire neighborhood? It was the beginning of the end. Jack folded his arms, leaning against his railing. This time, Karen wasn't smirking. And that? That was the sweetest victory yet. It didn't take long for the dominoes to fall. With video evidence proving Karen had orchestrated an illegal dumping scheme to frame him, law enforcement launched a full-scale investigation into the Oak Ridge HOA. At first, Karen doubled down, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too damning to ignore. Investigators dug deeper, and what they found was worse than anyone expected: financial fraud, forged property claims, and years of mismanaged HOA funds. The media ran with the story. Local news stations splashed Karen's face across their broadcasts. HOA president under investigation for property fraud and misconduct. Residents who had once feared Karen's authority now came forward with their own stories: wrongful fines, sudden foreclosures, intimidation tactics. It turned out Jack wasn't the first person she had tried to destroy, just the first who fought back. The county launched an official audit of the HOA, freezing its assets while investigators combed through years of financial records. Then came the final blow. One afternoon, Jack was fixing his fence when a fleet of police cruisers rolled into Oak Ridge. This time, they weren't questioning Karen. They were arresting her. Handcuffed and humiliated, she was escorted off HOA property while stunned residents watched from their porches. She screamed at reporters, insisting it was all a conspiracy, but no one listened. Karen was charged with property fraud, falsification of legal documents, and misappropriation of HOA funds. With her gone, the entire HOA board collapsed. Facing public backlash and legal scrutiny, the county permanently dissolved the Oak Ridge HOA, barring any future attempts to annex private property. Jack had won. And just to make sure no other HOA tried to pull the same stunt, he put up a bold new sign at the edge of his property. Private property, not HOA territory. Trespassers will be sued. HOA Karen free zone. For the first time in weeks, Jack sat on his porch, beer in hand, and finally relaxed. Karen had spent years abusing her power, convinced she was untouchable. But in the end, she learned a simple truth: some people refuse to be bullied. What about you? Have you ever had to fight back against an HOA or a Karen in your neighborhood? Share your story below. Let's see who had it worse.